Hey, U.S. history students, it's Baker's Backyard again. Hope you're doing well. We're going to dive into one of the most interesting, yet one of the most controversial presidencies in American history, and that is the era of Richard Nixon. We're going to focus our attention today on domestic policy because last time we actually addressed, some of the strategies that he used to move us, at least in principle, beyond the Vietnam War. His SALT I treaty, his détente policy, in other words, foreign policy ventures. Today, we'll look at the direction of the economy that affects his presidency, and eventually, probably his most well-known, shall we say, tragedy or whatever you want to call it, and that is, of course, the Watergate Scandal. So let's dive in. So we have three objectives that we're going to continue to look at with our next session with Ford and also Carter. Those will be the presidents that succeed him in that order to finish out the decade. And so what we notice, guys, is that we want to be able to explain the domestic problems that impacted the U.S. during the 70s. We're going to focus more on things like stagflation, economic things, and then, of course, the famous resignation and the events that led up to that. Okay. How does Nixon respond to this economic crisis, or this set of things that lead us into this crisis? And then we'll also look, like I said a moment ago, how does Ford, in a very short amount of time in our next session, and then also Carter, guys, how does he also deal with a lot of somewhat similar kinds of things when you're looking at the energy crisis and some of the other energy things that we'll look at. We want to explain the importance of the moon landing, right? And so, a lot of us guys, if you were born after July 20th of 1969, then if you're like me, you're like, man, how cool would that have been to actually be able to watch that on live TV? I want to say that even to this day, it's the most widely watched event in the history of the world. I believe it still holds that accolade, or whatever you want to call it. So very cool to think about. Now, for those of you that are, on the conspiracy side, you can certainly have your opinions on that. But nonetheless, it's going to be an event that basically defines a lot of our morale. And we'll look at a little fun clip on that. And then thirdly, and guys, we're not going to spend a lot of time on Watergate. So what I would encourage you to do is we're going to watch a short video on that to kind of bring some basic details to your attention. But what we really want to think about, guys, with Watergate, and I think this is beyond just the event of the resignation, is what impact does that have on public trust? Trust as in, can we trust our president? Can we trust our government leaders, our officials? Okay. And what you'll notice, guys, is that this event is very much going to be one of those things that really defines, you could argue even today, almost 47 years later, the history of the country and so forth. And so, Ford, as we'll look at in our next session, has a big decision to make within a month of Nixon resigning. And that is, what do? Do you just let this gentleman have his eventual day in court? You pardon him? And if you're unclear on the answer to that question, then stay tuned to next session. But it's a very important decision. So what's going on, guys, when Nixon is transitioning the presidency? Well, first of all, you got to understand some of the foreign policy, just to review these. Remember we talked, guys, about the development of the arms reduction. Not everybody in the United States is really going to be like, yeah, cool, let's sign this SALT I treaty. You had your critics, but remember from last session, does it get passed by the Senate? Yes. And so that's, if you want to look at it as a feather in Nixon's cap, definitely something that is going to define that. Now, you might be wondering, okay, stagflation and also us hitting a period of recession, what exactly is a good working definition of stagflation? We'll look at this a little bit more in depth and discuss the effects with the economic problems more. But essentially, guys, if you think about the two big parts of that, inflation, stagnant economy, meaning that the economy is losing ground, unemployment is going up at large rates. So in other words, the economy is losing steam. We're not growing the way that we had been used to. Guys, you're going to remember from between about 1950 and 1970, with a few exceptions along the line, a little bit of roller coaster ride, as the business cycle suggests, you do have a very stable economy, all right, for the United States. Now, does everybody benefit from what some people call in the 50s, especially this affluent society? Unfortunately, the answer to that question is no, but we have seen a degree of rise with the middle class. People are used to having things. In the 70s, you're going to see a very big change when the economy goes into a state of stagflation and also, of course, inflation, where prices are going up. All right, so we'll come back to that. Okay. Um, this stuff that you see at the bottom here, the rise of religious and political radicalism, this is something that we'll see a bit more, um, I guess what I would call directly, you could say, guys, with the administration of President Carter. Like when you're looking at the, especially the Iranian hostage crisis, which really kind of defines but the last, I don't know, year and a half, a little bit less than that of his term. And so those will be things that we look at next time. But why do I bring these up? We're looking at trends and things that basically link the earlier part of the 70s to the latter part. Okay. And so Nixon, guys, really quick, keep in mind, he could have been a two-term president. He is elected to 2 terms, 68 and 72 respectively. He does not fulfill his second term. That's going to be where we see Ford finishing out that second term. The election of 68 is, like we said, a pretty interesting race. Vietnam is one of the bigger things that pops up quite a bit. Nixon does successfully win that election. It by no means was a landslide for him. Keep in mind, he's going to, kind of create some strategies to try to put himself in a position to be reelected with a much stronger base in 72. That does have some outcomes that we'll look at in a second, but unfortunately, almost that entire second part of his, or part of his second term, pardon me, that he served is going to be heavily centered around Watergate, and then also even, if you think about it, the bringing the end to the Vietnam War. Okay, so economic difficulties are really going to have a major effect on Nixon. Now, this slide right here, guys, if you're watching, would be a really good slide to pause and to really think about the details that you see in front of you. Because if you think about it, guys, what is really a problem when you basically have stagflation? Okay, so think about what I just said a moment ago. You've got inflation, that basically prices are going up at a pretty steady rate, and then you've got high levels of unemployment. So that's kind of like throwing fuel on the fire. The economy is worsening as prices are basically going up. Okay, and you could say, well, is there more to it than just the fact that you've got businesses that are losing ground? Yeah, there's a little bit, if you want to read about it, guys, with how the Fed basically monitors the monetary policy, and the policy that Nixon, or the decision, pardon me, that Nixon makes about taking America off the gold standard and things like that. You certainly have a lot of things that go a step further than things we're going to look at today. But this is something that overall sets in around 1973. Okay. And so what happens, to kind of add, pardon the pun here, guys, with the oil embargo thing, fuel to the fire, is you basically have, again, a lot of us, guys, when we think of oil, what part of the world tends to get the most attention a lot of times? Yeah, you're exactly right, the Middle East. Okay. And so the administration basically is observing a war. It's not on the slide here, but just background, called the Yom Kippur War. Basically, Israel is having conflict again with some of their neighboring Arab states. A lot of these Arab states are very oil rich. They control a lot of the oil production. What happens? They basically make a decision, when America sides more with Israel, to actually embargo trade with the United States. The OPEC, Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, is what that stands for. And a lot of us might be thinking, why is that such a big deal? Well, guys, you clearly see gas lines. Now, I was not alive then, The students that I have were not alive then. Perhaps some of your parents were. But guys, these gas lines will become very much associated with a lot of the things that we see, not just in the era of President Nixon, but also as we move throughout parts of Ford's time in office, and then also Carter. And if you're kind of wondering, yeah, Mr. Baker, this wasn't really a dramatic change in oil prices, think again. Okay, so I mean, if you take a look, guys, at 1973, you don't have to memorize these numbers, but man, I mean, look at this, guys. I mean, $11 for a barrel of oil back around 1973, and within, I mean, you can do the math here, guys, or at least try to. I mean, within probably a month or less, what happens? I mean, look, you're going from about $11 per barrel all the way up to 48 bucks. And a lot of you might be thinking, well, okay, we're going to have to pay, what was it, like 25 to 89 cents for a gallon of gas on the average or whatever it was. But guys, imagine what else do we as consumers use that requires oil to be able to get products to us? Well, we use everything, right? Milk, eggs, bread, toothbrushes, toothpaste, whatever it is. In other words, things that get to our stores are going to be transported by, obviously, transportation pieces, whether it's semis, airplanes, or whatever. So this is going to have a big effect overall. Now, kind of a little fun fact. A lot of you guys are, well, man, Mr. Baker, this kind of, starts to kind of go down. You see a little bit of a roller coaster ride. What's going to happen around 1979 or 1980-ish to basically make a lot of these prices go up again? Well, it's actually another crisis, but it's actually more of a war between, Iran and Iraq, right? And so stay tuned for a few weeks from now when we talk about the first Gulf War. In my experience, being a 16-year-old guy or student, pardon me, that was in a lot of your shoes and seeing oil prices go up some then, I'll tell you the story later. And you can clearly see that this embargo is going to actually have a big problem, okay? So if you're Nixon, and I wouldn't exactly say that Nixon was, an ultra conservative across the board, but even if you're somebody that believed wholeheartedly or even partially heartedly in the idea of letting the economy, letting the market work itself out, Nixon's response is basically going to be not exactly supported by a lot of conservative economists. Okay, I don't know if I would go as far to say that it was entirely something along the line of Keynesian, or at least, non-laissez-faire, but you'll notice freezes on prices, you'll notice freezes on wages, you'll also notice freezes on rent. Okay, I heard a story that even, for example, I think it was in the state of Wisconsin, if I'm not mistaken, where they put a freeze on rent nationwide, right? Each state cannot up or lower it. And the state of Wisconsin was trying to be really kind, and they lowered their rent. And believe it or not, that was a violation of the freeze. And of course, they got some backlash on that. Okay. Kind of a fun story, guys, as far as Nixon with this energy crisis, is Nixon around this time dealing with it, says something along the lines that, America will kind of get the ball rolling to an extent with, we build the Alaska pipeline, or at least we started in this period of time. And we said, or he said, excuse me, by the end of the decade of the 1970s, America will not be relying on any forms of energy other than its own. In other words, complete or close to it energy independence. How'd that work? Okay. Because the big debate is, guys, as we'll look at later, is does America start to adjust, to the idea of full fuel efficient cars? Do we move in the direction of alternative energy the way that we should have, at least when? Those are really big questions that we'll look at in our next session. Okay. And so those are the economic things in a nutshell. Now, Nixon also, guys, this is where there's a pretty strong degree of conservatism that comes into it. And then we'll look in the moon landing, like I said, in one of our objectives. But Nixon, guys, if you think about it, he is seen, as the nation has, a great deal of government growth over the course of the last, really 20 to 30 years. If you go all the way back to the FDR New Deal, you could even say 40 really if you go back to the early 30s. And so Nixon is trying to figure out a way of, okay, we now have Social Security, we now have Medicare and Medicaid, we have a lot more federal government responsibility. How do we basically make it to where the states have some degree of responsibility with actually making some of these policies work? And this is where Nixon is going to put forth, guys, a policy of what we call new federalism. Okay, and the basic nuts and bolts of it, before we look at the next slide and explain it and define it more, is the big picture of this is that we want to transfer what? Power to the states. The question there is how and also why. Well, this is basically, if you want to pause, guys, the screen and write this down, might be a good idea too. But the basic nuts and bolts of new federalism, and by the way, this is not going to be just unique to Nixon. You see this resurface in the earlier 80s with Reagan as well. So it's a policy that kind of furthers some with other presidents later on. But look at what it says: the transfer of certain powers from U.S. federal government back to the states. Okay. As a policy theme, this typically, talk about new federalism, guys, involves the federal what? Government providing block grants to the states to resolve some kind of social or political issue. Okay, so the example I want to share with you, imagine that each one of you are states. I'm Ohio, so-and-so is North Carolina, so-and-so is Hawaii, doesn't matter. And the federal government basically gives you, if you've not heard of a grant is kind of like a big block of money. So you've got block grants and you've got what are called categorical grants. Those are the two main kinds you hear about. Categorical would be, I'm giving state of North Carolina $100 million basically so that they can fix their roads. The category is roads or transportation. With a block grant, you don't really have a specific category. Therefore, states have to make decisions. What do I spend this money that the federal government's giving me on? Well, look at the scenario. Okay, you're a state. The federal government hands you $100 million. That would be interesting. And you have to basically spend it. And you as the governor, you as the state legislature or the General Assemblies, a lot of states are called, you have to make a decision. What do you spend it on? Do you spend it on education? Do you spend it on transportation, healthcare, Social Security, other things that maybe are pressing needs? Now, we know that every state has a different set of needs for a variety of different reasons. Population is different, whatever the case may be. Okay? And so I want you to really think, guys, for a moment, pause your screen and ponder this. What would be the reason why, perhaps, the federal government would want to transfer more power, responsibility, or even some people would say authority to these states to be able to basically use federal funds, or shall we say federal money? Well, if you pause the screen and thought about it, I'd be curious to see what y'all said, but a lot of that, guys, is the federal government. You can say, well, states had to make decisions about the resources that we actually provided to them. Okay, so let's say you were to write your federal government and you said, hey, you're not giving us enough of this and that to support our programs, and I live in the state of Wyoming or wherever. You could say, well, we basically put the ball in kind of like your state's court, as the saying goes sometimes. And here it is, they made a decision. And I don't know if you're completely transferring all the blame, if you want to use that word, to the states, but you're certainly transferring responsibility for them to carry out some of the duties. All right. Now, whether that's a good idea or not, that's completely for you all to have to decide on. But that was a big fixture of Nixon as we transition into his first and part of his second term. Okay. The question is, too, kind of a fun thing, where does this moon landing come into it? I want you to think, guys, as we transition to the short little video, kind of a fun thing I'm going to show you just really quick, about what you might know about this, what things come to mind, and then we'll kind of introduce the clip. The clip is short, but it's kind of a fun thing I want to share with you, and we'll kind of continue this before we wrap this up with about a 15-minute conversation on Watergate. Okay, you sister students, you still with me? Okay, so I want you to pretend that you are Buzz Aldrin, Neil Armstrong, etc. You are a part of that Apollo 11 crew, and you have just done what nobody has done before, and that is, of course, land on the moon. And lo and behold, who calls you to actually congratulate you and make you feel really warm and fuzzy? President Nixon. Let's watch and hear.
I found a way to run my old computers with no hard drive. Here it is, and it's not in this computer.
This may be a function of the student as well as lack of gravity force here. Tranquility Base, this is Houston. Can we get both of you on the camera for a minute, please? I think we're going to have one here. I want both of them in the field of view. Roger, let's get both of you in the field of view of the camera for a minute. Yeah, I think something rather important is coming up here. Neil and Buzz, the President of the United States is in his office now and would like to say a few words to you. Over. That would be an honor. Go ahead, Mr. President. This is Houston out. Hello, Neil and Buzz. I'm talking to you by telephone from the Oval Room at the White House. And this certainly has to be the most historic telephone call ever made from the White House. I just can't tell you how proud we all are of what you have done. For every American, this has to be the proudest day of our lives. And for people all over the world, I am sure that they too join with Americans in recognizing what an immense feat this is. Because of what you have done, the heavens have become a part of man's world. And as you talk to us from the sea of tranquility, it inspires us to redouble our efforts to bring peace and tranquility to earth. For one priceless moment in the whole history of man, all the people on this earth are truly one. One in their pride in what you have done, and one in our prayers that you will return safely to earth.
I don't know about all of you guys, but that to me is pretty cool. I can't fathom, one, being up on the moon to begin with, and two, taking a telephone call from basically the highest office, not just in the country, but you could argue possibly in the world community. So, we know, if you go back and you look at the date, July 20th of 1969, Kennedy, as we looked at in one of our previous lessons, isn't in a position to see this, but definitely you cannot talk about this, guys, without the work of Kennedy, LBJ, of course, succeeding him, supporting the program, and even Eisenhower supporting the establishment of NASA before. So, by no means do we want to give Nixon all the credit here, but it's very interesting that he, of course, takes a lot of, shall we say, pride in the United States doing that. Okay, so fast forward the clock to 1972. You've got a lot of things that have happened. You've got economic problems that are going on. Nixon is up for re-election, and this is where we start to see attention brought to the eventual scandal we associate with Watergate. A lot of people, guys, ask the question, well, was this election really a close election? And the answer is that Not really, right? When you if you look at the final verdict or outcome, we know that the presidency is not determined by the popular vote like it is the electoral college, but Nixon gets about 60.2 or 7% of the popular vote. He got 520 of 538 electoral votes. Okay. And then, so that to me is a pretty strong showing as far as the electoral college, et cetera, right? Very few presidents, guys, in American history can claim that percentage of the popular vote and also that many electoral votes. All right. But Nixon is one of those. So, what brings about this presidential downfall that we associate with Watergate? Okay. Well, just something to keep in mind as we transition to the video to kind of give you some context. So, it's very important for us to keep in mind that when we're talking about Watergate, it is a scandal that not only involves the issue of the break-in, but it also involves eventually the cover-up. Okay. And while there's some historical debate on this, how much did Nixon know? How much did Nixon not know? I would argue that the big thing that leads to his eventual downfall and resignation is the cover-up side of the actual break-in. Okay. And so that's something to keep in mind. And so, the real big nuts and bolts, guys, if you go back and you look at even pre-presidency with Nixon, but especially during, the times where you're seeing a lot of leaking of the information, like the Pentagon Papers with the Vietnam War, you're noticing that Nixon is getting, some people would say a bit hysterical about, leaks and everything. And so he starts to basically support, the wiretappings and things like that. This is where, again, you could say, well, is this early signs of eventually what's going to happen with Watergate, et cetera? Okay. And, we can't give Nixon a complete pass with, things like, he did have an enemies list. Okay. So I think it was Ford, his VP. We'll look at his rise to the VP in our next session. I think it was Ford when he found out about the enemies list. He said something along the lines: anybody who has to have a list of enemies has way too many enemies. Okay. But Nixon constantly had just, I guess it was in the back of his mind, this idea that people were out to get him, et cetera. And therefore, you see this hysteria popping up. Okay. At the end of the day, when you're looking at the Watergate scandal, and you might want to, guys, pause it here, there's a basic, this is very basic. This is not in depth by any means. You can read a lot of other stuff on it. The video we're going to watch in a moment kind of highlights it more. But guys, if you look at it, again, these 7 basic things are eventually taking us in the direction of what happens to kind of lead to some of the Watergate things. And then also, of course, the culminating event of it before the pardon by Ford, which is going to be the resignation. Okay. And so pause it there, look at these. You don't have to memorize every single little detail here, but wiretapping, break-in, the committee for re-election of the president, a bunch of creeps, as some people like to call them, actually broke into this not White House, excuse me, the Watergate Hotel. If you ever watch Forrest Gump, they depict Forrest being the one that kind of blows the whistle, which we know is really not the case, but nonetheless, something that kind of leads down more investigation. Okay. Nixon, again, starts to intercede, trying to use executive power to kind of put a stop, or to kind of put tighten the reins on furthering investigations. And then it gets to the point where Congress pretty much is like, well, we know you have these tapes, and you know what? You got to hand them over. All right, we'll come back to this in a second. What happens is that Nixon is not going to cooperate. Okay. Eventually, you'll see that there's what they call the smoking gun tape, that eventually there's like this, I think it was like an 18 to 22-minute gap in one of the tapes that eventually was handed over. When Nixon basically loses the court case that we'll look at more in a second, called U.S. versus Nixon, 1974, it's kind of, as the saying goes, the handwriting's on the wall, that Nixon is going to be in a position to where the Supreme Court does not agree with him. Of course, the Congress does not agree with him. And then shortly thereafter, we know that, of course, he makes a decision. Now, he actually announces this August 9th of 1974 resignation the night before. Okay. And we're not going to watch the clip on his resignation, but if you are in my class and you have access to the Canvas module or post, there is a copy of that there for you to watch if you desire to watch it. Okay. But it's interesting to see the way that Nixon, his body language, the way he addresses the public. There's a lot of course, people that have strong opinions about it, even years later. And then Ford, just really quick before our next session, we'll go into this in more detail. Ford has a big decision to make. Nixon has resigned. The law can still technically go after him. And I'll show you a little poster here in a second that might make us think a little bit about that. Does the law ever actually get to try him? No. And part of that is the pardon. Okay. So what I would like for us to do, guys, really quick is I'm going to show you a video that will walk us through the steps of Watergate. It's going to give us a little bit more food for that. When we get back, we'll wrap this up and we'll basically transition to what we'll look at next time. And hope you all are getting something on this video, and just please watch, take a few things down if you want to.
This was one of the biggest political scandals in American history. Welcome to WatchMojo.com, and today we'll be learning more about the Watergate Scandal.
The thing that's so appalling to me is that the president, when this whole idea was suggested to him, didn't in righteous indignation rise up and say, "Get out of here, you're in the office of the President of the United States. How can you talk about blackmail and bribery and keeping witnesses silent?"
In mid-1971, the Pentagon Papers were leaked. That report proved that administrations from Truman to Johnson had intentionally expanded their Vietnam War efforts, in contrast to what the public was told. The Nixon administration then panicked and formed a covert group to halt leaks. Nixon advisor John Ehrlichman assembled the White House plumbers and included former CIA agent E. Howard Hunt and former FBI agent G. Gordon Liddy. Soon, the president's political rivals were recorded on Nixon's enemies list. Politicians, journalists, and even Hollywood actors Nixon feared could stop his re-election were included and were harassed by the administration with tax audits, legal action, and more. Prior to the 1972 election, the Republicans created a committee for the re-election of the president, or CRP. John Mitchell stepped down as Attorney General to chair that committee. The CRP used questionable and illegal means to achieve their goal. For example, Mitchell kept a slush fund to subsidize information gathering on the Democrats. Ultimately, a plan was approved to bug and steal information from the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate Hotel. On June 17, 1972, during the second of these break-ins, the burglars were arrested.
The Democratic National Committee is trying to solve a spy mystery. It began before dawn Saturday when 5 intruders were captured by police inside the offices of the committee in Washington.
The FBI quickly linked those arrested with Hunt. Because of Hunt's connection to the plumbers, Nixon ordered his chief of staff, Bob Haldeman, to instruct the CIA to block further FBI investigation into the finances behind the Watergate break-in. The cover-up began.
Mr. Nixon, did you know about the burglary of our Democratic National Headquarters at the Watergate?
The Nixon administration then officially denied involvement in the burglary. However, more clues emerged that conflicted with this. Aside from the Hunt connection, one of the burglars was a Republican Party aide, and a paper trail led to the CRP. On June 20th, Washington Post journalists Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein reported on the Hunt connection, with confirmation from their anonymous source, Deep Throat. This team was instrumental in unraveling the Watergate case and in implicating the Justice Department, the FBI, the CIA, and the White House. In 2005, Deep Throat was revealed as former FBI Deputy Director Mark Felt. By September 1972, the burglars, Hunt and Liddy, were indicted by a grand jury. Despite connections to the scandal, Nixon was decisively re-elected that November. The burglars pleaded guilty before Hunt and Liddy went to trial in early '73. The scandal soon exploded when many of the administration's important figures were implicated. In April, 4 top Nixon aides lost their jobs due to their involvement in the cover-up. Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Attorney General Richard Kleindienst, and White House lawyer John Dean. Official investigations began in mid-1973, led by Senator Sam Ervin and Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox. They proved the connection between the burglary and the White House and CRP. Dean became a valuable witness when he divulged Nixon knew about the cover-up. In July, Nixon assistant Alexander Butterfield explosively revealed the existence of Nixon-installed recording devices throughout the White House. Those tapes were subpoenaed. However, Nixon refused to release them, citing executive privilege.
This principle of confidentiality of presidential conversations is at stake in the question of these tapes. I must and I shall oppose any efforts to destroy this principle, which is so vital to the conduct of this great office.
To save himself, Nixon dismissed the Attorney General, his deputy, and Cox in the Saturday Night Massacre. Public outcry followed, and Nixon responded with one of his most quoted speeches in November '73.
People have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
By March, the Watergate Seven were indicted. Many spent time in prison, and though Nixon was named, he remained unindicted. The Watergate tapes were finally released in July 1974. An 18-minute erased section proved controversial. Of the exposed facts, it was found that some involved in the break-in had received hush money. Most importantly, the smoking gun tape undeniably proved Nixon knew about the cover-up since mid-1972. Nixon was forced to step down or face impeachment. On August 8, 1974, Nixon resigned and was replaced by Gerald Ford. Exactly 1 month later, Ford officially pardoned him. This controversy resulted in multiple arrests, the creation of new laws, renewed interest in investigative journalism, and the first resignation of a U.S. president. The Watergate scandal undoubtedly changed American politics forever.
Okay, what do you think about all those details? Now, guys, you don't need to remember every little name. That's why I have this slide there for you to kind of think about. But I do think it's interesting for us to at least ask ourselves about some of these principles of why Congress gets involved. A lot of you guys, if you were watching the video, you were like, well, what is that executive privilege idea? Obviously, one of the activities we're going to do, guys, for our study of this that you'll be doing as an assignment is going to be analyzing political cartoons. This one's here, so I'd like for you to find a different one when you get to that assignment. But, you know, most of you have probably heard of "I am not a crook," statement. Of course, the press had a field day with that. But what leads eventually, guys, to this resignation? And you heard a couple of things thrown around: hush money, attorney general, all these different things. What I think is important here to keep in mind is that this concept of executive privilege. Okay. Now, Nixon, as you saw in his speech about constitutional principle, this is not the first time in American history that executive privilege has been used or basically coined, if you will. I shouldn't say coined, but actually put forth as an idea. Washington does it in the first presidency. Presidents between Washington and Nixon, presidents since Nixon have. Okay, so you might be wondering, okay, what exactly is that? Well, the argument is that you're withholding some information from in public interest, and in this case, it was the tapes with Congress. Okay. Now, there's a lot of constitutional debate, and that's not the purpose of us having this part of the lesson, about where is this specifically in the Constitution. And constitutional scholars have debates about this all the time. Is it there? Is it not there? Is it implied or whatever? But at the end of the day, what Congress has to, what the Supreme Court has to basically consider, guys, in this case, U.S. versus Nixon in '74, is whether or not Nixon is correctly using, if you will, this principle to withhold public information or whatever. The Supreme Court does not agree with Nixon. And the end result of that is the House could then, basically say, okay, we're going to push forward with impeachment. And of course, they brought up articles. Now, it's very easy, guys, and I'll end with this last couple of things here, to basically be like, well, Nixon was impeached. He was not formally impeached by the House the way that President Johnson, President Clinton, and now President Trump had been. Okay. But I think it's safe to say that, when they were considering the articles of impeachment that were passed, then the whole House, I'm sure, would have impeached him, and I think the Senate would have basically removed him. Okay, but that's something that obviously never happened, but is something to keep in mind. Okay, so I don't think you need to worry, guys, about memorizing the date of the resignation, but I think the fact that you saw, guys, clearly about, hey, it's the involvement and the cover up and the knowledge about it that to me stands out quite a bit. Okay, so the thing that we want to ask ourselves as we wind down here is the following, and that is this: wanted. Now, this is not a rocket science question, but it's, I think, important. Who's the only person not apprehended? You got it. Nixon. Okay. All the other people, some of these are more well-known names than the others. Now, I'll be honest with you, when I was graduating my undergrad in college back in '97, I had studied Watergate in college, majored in history, and guess who our guest speaker was for our commencement? It was Charles Colson. That's the guy that I actually have the cursor on. Obviously, guys, people were basically found guilty. Some of them did prison time for their involvement. Nixon does not. So I'm going to leave you with the question to consider for our next whole class session for those of you that can attend, and that is actually several things. One, imagine that you have, a different outcome. Nixon's not pardoned. He basically is tried. He's apprehended and convicted. Okay. And you can open up a book in American history that actually has this poster as Nixon apprehended, and also has the history of the United States with a president actually having been put in prison and actually found guilty for this kind of thing. Okay. My question, guys, for you to think about is, do you think Nixon resigning was the right move? Did he do it for the right reasons? Did he do it because he was trying to kind of allow the country to move on beyond all these things? And secondly, and maybe more importantly beyond that, if you're Ford, taking into consideration all these things, and there's a lot to think about, guys, beyond that, do you basically pardon Nixon if you're President Ford? Ponder that for next time. Guys, thank you for your attention. Have a great one. Stay safe. And as always, email me and let me know if you have any questions. And take care. And I will see you next time in Baker's Backyard. Thanks. Have a good one.